All right, so for next time, right, so we're finished with Candide as of today. You're going to be bringing the Rousseau on the social contract from now on, right? So we're going to be doing 4 sessions on this. It's conveniently divided up into 4 short books. So for next time, you're going to be reading the foreword, which is a single page, so not that big a deal, and book 1. So a total of about 15, 16 pages for next time, okay? And you're also going to choose a quote for a free write. Now, this might be a little bit harder to analyze at first than something like Candide, because it's not a work of fiction, right? It's a work of political philosophy. But you should still be able to find, patterns of language, and even these kind of like opposing ideas, right, that Rousseau is putting in tension with each other in order to come up with arguments about this, okay? So before we get into finishing up with Candide, I do also just want to show you some stuff I've put up on the Georgia View page for all of you to help you with the Rousseau if you need a little bit of context for it. And it's making a spinny sound so we know it's working. Okay, so once the Georgia View page for the course loads, so you see here in the content browser, I've got a folder labeled Rousseau on the social contract. Click on that, and I've got a bunch of stuff here for you. I've got 2 BBC radio podcasts, one on Rousseau generally, and one on the idea of the social contract. I've also pulled a couple of articles here from the Stanford Encyclopedia, I can't talk today, of philosophy. 1 on social contract theory generally, and 3 on thinkers in this realm who influenced Rousseau and whom he directly references in his book, right? So it would probably be a good idea for you to try to get a little bit familiar with the ideas of Thomas Hobbes, the ideas of John Locke, and the ideas of Hugo Grotius. Because one thing I noticed about these editions, right, their benefit is that they're really cheap. The detriment is that they tend not to have very good footnotes or endnotes. So I'm just kind of trying to get out in front of this here by pointing out that it's not that hard to find out what these guys actually thought. So when Rousseau references them, you'll know what he's talking about. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about Rousseau or about anything that's coming up? Everybody good? Everybody with me? All right, great. So then let's go ahead and finish up with Candide. Now that we're done with this, what y'all think of it?
It was kind of confusing for me.
Yeah, it's hard to read.
Yeah.
Okay, and what made it confusing or hard to read?
Well, for me, it was some of the language that was used. And
Okay.
then when I would think in my mind, okay, this person is gone. No need to think about them anymore. And then next thing you know, they're back alive.
Yeah. Very, very few people actually die permanently. So yeah, so at least you recognize what's going on there, right? That people tend to come back after they die. And yeah, some of the it's a slightly old-fashioned translation, so some of the language is probably a little bit difficult. Plus, some of the language is intended to be a little bit difficult. Like when somebody like Pangloss talks, because he's supposed to be talking bullshit, a lot of the language that's put into his mouth is, kind of big abstract words that don't actually mean anything, right? Other impressions y'all had of this?
Kind of like reading Shakespeare.
Okay, what was like reading Shakespeare about it?
The old language, the almost abstract storytelling. It's not very clear.
No, it's not very. In fact, it's almost circular, right? We almost end up coming back to the point where we started. although with a difference, which I think we'll get to as we talk about this. But yeah, the structure is not linear, and the plot, there isn't really much of a plot, right? Things happen to the same character, and I think they do all kind of build up to something. But yeah, there isn't really a plot in the conventional sense, or much of one. So what this novella is an example of a literary style called the Picaresque. And Picaresque, it comes from a Spanish word, picaro. And a picaro is this sort of like roguish, live by his wits kind of figure. And a picaresque novel is episodic in structure, right? Rather than following a single linear narrative, right? What links the episodes together is that they happen to the same character or set of characters. And the hero, as I said, is a figure who lives, right, by luck or by his wits, rather than through powering through on strength, right? So one thing that might have made this a little confusing is just not being experienced with this particular kind of narrative. People don't write a lot like this anymore. Other impressions you had of this?
The whole book was like shotgun information. Very quick.
Yeah, the chapters are very short. Episodes are tend to be very brief, right? So yeah, and a lot happens in a very short space, right? 87 pages is not really that much space for this much to happen. So I get that a lot of the events are probably a little difficult to sort through, right? And some of the characters might also be a little bit difficult to sort through because people come and go. A lot of people come and go through the course of this novel, right? Or novella. If you were to take any ideas away from it, right? Let's just try to think about the worldview that's being illustrated or promoted here, right? If you think this novella is making any kind of arguments, what do you think those arguments might be? And I say arguments plural on purpose. I think there's more than one at work here. There isn't some kind of single moral to pull out of this.
Circumstances of life are way out of your control.
Okay. And give me some evidence for that.
I mean, with Candide's whole journey across the world, he didn't really want to do any of that. He was following Candide from Cunigunda.
Uh-huh. Although he also could have stopped following her at any point, right?
Yeah, he could have, but because he, loved her so much and that he didn't want to break his promise,
Uh-huh.
he didn't feel like he had a choice.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So there are a lot of things that happen to Candide that are outside of his immediate realm of control, right? There's things that happen to him and to people around him that are imposed on them, right? Rather than the result of their free choices. So we could then kind of think about this in terms of, we might come back to this, right? A fate or free will binary, right? Whether things happen because they're designed to happen in a certain way, right? Whether some outside force has decided things are going to happen in this way. Or do they happen this way because you've freely chosen them, right? And Pangloss's philosophy, does it seem more like a fatalist philosophy or more like a free will, you do what you want philosophy, or you are able to do whatever you will?
It's kind of
Okay, why would you say both?
Because his philosophy is unlike things are how they are, they're out of our control, but he kind of approaches them in a light-hearted manner.
Okay. Yeah, Pangloss is a pretty, even as he is like, dying of syphilis, or a slave on a galley in Constantinople, or being hanged by the Inquisition, right? He always goes smiling and dancing.
Yeah, he's a very optimistic person.
Yeah, like stupidly optimistic, right?
Optimistically fatalistic.
Yeah, and I think if we think about like the basic upshot of his philosophy, right? If we live in the best of all possible worlds, can anything we do change that?
Not according to his philosophy.
Yeah, not according to his philosophy, right? So we could probably put him more on the fate side of things, right? Now, what about his counterpart, Martin, who believes that all things that happen are bad? Now, granted, unlike Pangloss, Martin has reason to believe in his philosophy, right? His experiences have taught him that life is a bucket of shit that you step in. But is he any less fatalistic? Not really. Yeah, he also doesn't really seem to believe that you can do anything or change anything, right? That shit's gonna happen, and you just have to try to roll with it. So one of the reasons I want to do this, right, is because I want us to try to think about ways y'all could write a paper about this, right? I'm trying to look for things that you could organize a longer paper around. And one good way to do that is to think about what kinds of opposing forces we see pushing up against each other in the novella, right? So let's set aside fate and free will for a minute, because I think there's a lot of other stuff we could explore here. Do you see other kind of opposed ideas that bang up against each other here? Even things that might even be related to fate or free will.
A lot of life and death.
Okay.
People dying and being resurrected.
Yeah. Does death actually seem to mean that much?
No.
Okay, so I think what we need to puzzle out here, right, is why does death here never seem to be permanent, right? Why do characters keep coming back? Let's think about instances in which death is permanent, right? Who actually dies for good and for real?
The man that built, I forgot his name. The man
John
that
the
built.
Anabaptist.
Yeah, James the Anabaptist actually dies for good and for real, right? Right, because the Bay of Lisbon exists specifically for him to drown in, as Pangloss proves through reason. Is there anybody else who dies permanently?
I don't think I remember reading about the Great Friar again.
Actually, Paquette and Brother Giroflée do come back, and they weren't killed to begin with, right? They just, Candide gives them some money to try to prove a point to Martin. It's like, see, if I give them money, they'll be happy. And then, they show up in Constantinople and are miserable. So neither of them actually dies. What about, are there people Candide kills who stay dead?
Baron?
The Baron actually does come back, right? So we can put him and Pangloss on the life side here, right?
And his girlfriend?
And Cunegonde, yes. Cunegonde also comes back from the dead, or from the apparently dead. Turns out she's only mostly dead. What about the Inquisitor and Don Issachar, the guys that Candide kills in Lisbon to free Cunegonde? They stay dead, right? And we might want to think about why these three characters stay dead, right? And why these three come back to life. In some cases, repeatedly, right? Pangloss comes back to life twice. Actually, so does the Baron, right? Why do you think these characters come back and these characters don't?
Well, the ones on the left, they are like main characters. And
Okay.
the others aren't really.
They're more important than Candide.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, these are all figures who are really more central to Candide's life, right? And also maybe think about their point of origin. Where do they all come from? They all come from that original barony of Thunder Ten Tronc, right? And if the plot of the novella is essentially circular, right, we have to end up to some extent back where we started. I think also that most of these characters exist primarily to advance the plot in some way, and not to advance any particular philosophical viewpoint. Though I think that we could also probably pull the Grand Inquisitor and Don Issachar out, as well as Cunegonde, because I think there is also, there's a discourse of sexual exploitation that runs through this as well. That, you know, it's there, it's kind of like under the surface, but it doesn't seem to be deeply questioned in the novella, right? It just seems to be kind of what happens to a lot of women. It happens to Cunegonde, it happens to the old woman, it happens to Paquette, it happens...
The woman with the friar, is that thing?
Yeah, Paquette is the old servant from Thunder Ten Tronc, right? Who also then has to be back there at the end when they are building their new little society, right? The two girls who work for Senator Pococurante, right? Also, he apparently, you know, sometimes takes them to bed with him as well, right? So we might want to put a pin in that and come back to that and see if that's something we can do something with as well. But yes, okay, so we've got these binaries, this fate and free will binary, this life and death binary. Are there other, let's think about other clues we get here to the novella's worldview, right? Its basic attitude towards, you know, say, France in the late 1750s. Are there any particular social groups or segments of society that seem to be singled out for particular criticism?
The church is a little.
Okay, yeah. Does Voltaire seem to be a fan of the Catholic Church? Yeah, not so much, right? What does he seem to think of the church? What do his ideas about the church seem to be based on the way they behave in the novella?
Everybody involved in the church is just garbage.
Okay. But let's like kind of think more specifically here. Like, what kinds of things do we see them doing? Okay, yeah. So, right? Oppression, censorship, right? And if we think about the reason they're burning heretics in Lisbon, right? Why are they doing that? What do they think is going to happen if they burn enough heretics?
It'll stop the volcano.
Yeah, there won't be any more earthquakes, right? We must have had an earthquake because we weren't burning enough heretics. So if we just burn more heretics, right? No more earthquakes. So they're also depicted as superstitious, right? That they believe these things that they have no valid reason for believing. I do, also just want to point out here, right, that we're picking apart Voltaire's view of the Catholic Church, right? Voltaire's views do not necessarily accord with my own, so I mean no insult or offense to anyone's particular religion. Okay. So, are there other groups that Voltaire seems to be critical of?
Royalty.
Okay, yeah, the nobility also comes in for criticism, right? And how do we see the nobility behaving here? What is his problem with the nobility?
They're conceited.
Yeah, they're conceited, they're elitist, right?
Stereotypically noble.
Yeah, like why won't the Baron allow Candide to marry Cunegonde?
Wrong kind of heritage.
Yeah, he's missing one quartering in his coat of arms, right? He's just not quite noble enough, the poor bastard, right? So the very idea of him marrying Mistress Cunegonde, even at the end of the novel, when Cunegonde has lost all of her charms, right, and Candide is going to marry her anyway just to keep his promise, the Baron still resists, right? Because how dare my sister, who has 72 quarterings, right, marry this guy who only has 71.
So he needed an extra one, or he needed a specific one that he didn't have?
He just needs he just needs one more. Yeah, it's just totally based on the number, right?
Okay.
And again, this is like, the joke here is that it's an exaggerated number, right? It's a ridiculously large number. Nobody had 71 quarterings on their coat of arms, right? But yeah, so the nobility are portrayed as elitist, as also like really kind of inflexible as well, right? Right. No matter what happens, the Baron will not change his mind, right? So, do y'all remember that three estates theory that we talked about last time? Okay, so what did that look like? How are the three estates structured?
The oratories, the delatories, and the laboratories.
That's right, yes. And who's who there?
Oh, the oratories in the church.
Yep.
The delatories in the nobility.
Mm-hmm.
Laboratories and everybody else.
Yes. So, if we're looking at Voltaire as a social critic in the France of his time, right? On whose side does he seem to be?
Everyone else's.
Yeah, the everyone else, right? So yeah, so we can kind of set up a binary there, right? The ordinary people. Up against these two privileged classes, right? But yeah, he seems to be on the side of the everybody else for a variety of reasons. So one potential argument that we pulled out that this might be making is that, you know, the circumstances of your life are largely out of your control. Are there other, like, broader arguments we can maybe pull out of this?
Becoming happy isn't as easy as achieving something, and it's over.
Uh-huh.
Harder than that.
Yeah. So I think that that's actually a good start there, right? So is happiness, or does happiness seem to be like a destination or a process?
More process.
Okay, good. And where are you getting that idea from?
Because even after Candide finds Cunegund and reunites with all his friends, he still isn't what he thought he would be.
Yeah. Cunegonde's ordeals have made her ugly, right? You know, he's had to spend most of his money purchasing the freedom of his friends and frenemies, right? He's, you know, far away in a large foreign city. He's killed a lot of people, yeah. And, you know, he has given up the happiness he could have known in El Dorado, right? He's been tricked, he's been robbed, you know, he's been pushed down rivers. So he's been through a lot of shit, right? But let's kind of look at, if we go to page 87, now let's kind of look at where Candide and his friends are at the end here of the novel. Can I get somebody to start reading for us from I Know Also Said Candide, near the top of the page?
Second paragraph.
Yep. Yeah, go for it.
I know also, said Candide, that we must cultivate our garden. You are right, said Pangloss, for when man was first placed in the Garden of Eden, he was put there, ut operator eum, that he might cultivate it. Which shows that man was not born to be idle. Let us work, said Martin, without disputing it, it is the only way to render life tolerable. The whole little society entered into this laudable design according to their different abilities. Their little plot and land produced plentiful crops. Cunegonde was indeed very ugly, but she became an excellent pastry cook. Paquette worked at embroidery. The old woman looked after the linen. They were all, not excepting Friar Giroflée, of some service or another, for he made a good joiner and became a very honest man. Pangloss sometimes said to Candide, there is a
Concatenation.
concatenation of events in this best of all worlds. For if you had not been kicked out of a magnificent castle for the love of Miss Cunegonde, if you had not been put into the Inquisition, if you had not walked all over America, if you had not been stabbed, if you had not stabbed the Baron, if you had not lost all your sheep from the fine country of El Dorado, you would not be here eating preserved citrons and pistachio nuts. All that is very well, answered Candide, but let us cultivate our garden.
Okay, thank you. So, what seems to be the picture of happiness here? How are we kind of back at the beginning but with a difference?
Characters have evolved.
Okay, yeah. Although some more than others, right? What's Pangloss still trying to do here, even in the next to last paragraph?
Making light of dark events.
Yeah, making light of dark events, and also just trying to rationalize something, right? As something fated, right? As part of some kind of natural order that tends always towards the good, right? If you hadn't suffered all of these horrible indignities and been through so much shit, right? You wouldn't be sitting here eating candy, right?
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
What does ut operator mean?
It's actually translated in the next clause, that he might cultivate it. Actually, let me just actually pause there for a second, back up to that. So that language is actually taken from the Latin translation of the book of Genesis. So it's a reference to Genesis chapter 3, verse 23, in which Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden and told that they are going to have to cultivate the land to earn their bread. So it's interesting to see a biblical reference here in a work by a writer who is pretty irreverent, right, towards religious institutions, although not necessarily towards all Christian believers, right? He seems to, like James the Anabaptist, for example, he treats with, dignity. So we might kind of think of this like the beginning of the novella as a sort of expulsion from Eden, right? From this place of happy ignorance, where Candide gets a little too much knowledge of Miss Cunegonde and is driven out of the barony, by a kick on the backside, and then forced to go and make his way in the world, right? And how is this little Eden they're building at the end different?
There.
Okay, it's earned this time, right? And yeah, what do we see everybody in Candide's little crew doing here?
Working.
Yeah, everybody's working, right? Everybody helps to cultivate the crops, right? One person becomes a carpenter, one becomes a pastry chef, one looks after the linens, one does embroidery, right? But everybody's doing something useful, right? Everybody's engaged in some kind of useful occupation. So this notion that we must cultivate our garden, what does this mean, and how does it represent movement from that we live in the best of all possible worlds idea that we started with? If we live in the best of all possible worlds, and everything tends naturally towards the good, because the world has been organized that way by some kind of outside principle, do we have to do anything to maintain that? It'll just take care of itself, right? So what is Candide arguing at the end of the novel then? And how does this represent a lesson learned?
Right now they have to I was just gonna say that now they have to do it on their own. Like now they have to work for it instead of just letting it come naturally.
Yeah, because it doesn't come naturally, right? As happy as they thought they might have been in Westphalia, right? As soon as something from outside comes into Westphalia and disrupts that, in the form of the army of the Bulgars, right? That whole system gets disrupted, right? And Pangloss keeps asserting that everything is for the best in the face of all of these horrible tragedies. And I think what's happening here, Candide's little rejoinder to Pangloss, is that things are good if we work to make them good, and if we want them to stay good, we have to continue working at it. And I think there's actually another binary at work here. Where does most of Pangloss's knowledge, such as it is, come from?
Theory.
Yeah, it's all theory, right? And what does the novella seem to oppose to theory? What's the other means of getting knowledge here?
Experience.
Yes, good. So theory tells you the way things ought to be, right? If everything worked according to this particular system. Experience tells you the way things actually are, which may or may not actually accord with theory, right? When it does accord with theory, it seems to be largely coincidence. So, experience teaches Candide that you can only hold on to what's good if you work for it. And what kind of work seems to be favored here? Intellectual work or physical work? Yeah, actually getting down to physical labor here seems to be the important way to go. And to give you some context for this as well, so in the latter part of the 18th century, there's a movement to try to democratize all forms of knowledge in France, right? So in addition to certain kinds of philosophical and religious knowledge being held kind of exclusively by the churches and the universities, a lot of craft knowledge was held by these powerful organizations called guilds that were kind of largely organized to protect the interest of large tradesmen, right? So, if you are, for example, a butcher, you don't necessarily want other people learning all of the skills of butchery so that they could go and do it themselves, right? You want them to continue to pay you to do it.
Guilds were kind of like colleges.
Yeah. Or really, I guess more like trade colleges. Yeah. There were kind of, you paid dues, and there was a training structure for apprentices. You'd be assigned to a master who would teach you the trade, and then you'd work for him for a while as a journeyman, and then eventually you would be able to strike out on your own, right? Once it was, once you wouldn't be in competition with him. So we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail when we talk about the run-up to the French Revolution. But some acquaintances of Voltaire's, including a biologist named Denis Diderot and a mathematician named Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, published a multi-volume encyclopedia, which is exactly what it sounds like, or it's an encyclopedia. It's a compendium of not just intellectual knowledge, but also of craft knowledge. There are all these diagrams of processes for making nails and screws and things like that, or for building a table, right? All of this kind of craft knowledge that's put into this. And this whole idea of democratizing knowledge was considered so dangerous and so disruptive to the social order that Diderot was a couple of times put into jail, and copies of the encyclopedia were seized and impounded, right, by the authorities. So censorship with serious legal consequences is a big reality in the period in which Voltaire is writing. As is the desire to get out to people, to ordinary people, things that various social elites know, right? To share that knowledge more broadly throughout society. All right, so there are a couple other places I could point us to here. Is there anything else that you all want to talk about, or that you have questions about?
There might be another binary we haven't gone over.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
Honor versus dishonor.
Okay. Give me an example.
Candide throughout basically the whole book never broke a promise.
That is true.
But there were many other characters that did
Uh-huh.
on multiple occasions.
Yes.
And it's just something I noticed.
Okay. And let's try to pull out the implications of that then, and whether the novel thinks that Candide is actually to be praised for this, right? What's the big main promise that he keeps? To marry Cunegonde, right? No matter what. Even when it comes to it, he doesn't really want to do it anymore. It's like, well, I made a promise, so here we go, right? So Candide sticks to his promises no matter what. Now, does the novella seem to regard this as a positive attribute? Is it good that Candide always sticks to his promises, especially when no one else around him ever seems to? Where else do we see people sticking to their principles?
The Baron sticks to his.
Yeah, the Baron sticks to his, right? But his principles are shit. Right? His principles are snobbish.
The two philosophers.
The two philosophers stick to their principles. Yeah, Pangloss, even as it's repeatedly proven that his philosophy is dumb, right? He sticks to it. In fact, he even says, in the final chapter, it's like, well, I can't go back on this because Leibniz can't be wrong, right? No, of course not. I mean, you saw that guy's wig. It's got to be right. And also, just like, when you've invested a lifetime, right, in a particular mode of thought, it's hard to change course. In general, the church also sticks to its guns, right? It sticks to its principles by suppressing anything that seems to oppose those principles. So, does sticking to your principles seem to be something Voltaire regards as a good thing?
He respects it, at least. It doesn't really matter what those principles are. He just respects that they keep to their own principles.
What were you about to say, Clayton?
I don't think he thinks it's good.
Okay, why not?
Because the only good that happens in the book is after everybody changes. The only thing that happens good for them is when they start to change and to do something else.
Yeah, you have to adjust based on your experiences, right? So the idea of sticking to your guns no matter what happens, right? If we look at the characters who tend to come out with the least amount of pain in the end, right? I would argue that those are probably the old woman whose suffering is mostly in the past, and Cacambo. Largely because they have no fixed principles, right? They just roll with whatever the world throws at them and adjust based on the situation, right? When Cunegonde is taken in by the governor of Buenos Aires, right? The old woman says, look, honestly, just go with it, right? That's going to be safer than waiting for Candide to do whatever he's going to do, right?
That's why Candide didn't stay in El Dorado.
Uh-huh. Yeah, Candide could have just remained in El Dorado and been comfortable there, right? But he had made this promise to rescue and marry Cunegonde, and so he leaves, right? Also, there are various reasons why we discussed why El Dorado may not be as ideal a society as it appears to be. But yeah, that is the main reason he leaves. Yeah, all of his restless wandering, right, is going in search of Mistress Cunegonde.
Seems like a grade A vacation spot, though.
Well, if you could get to it, which is part of the problem, right? Yeah, Candide and Cacambo only find it by accident.
Well, he knows where it is.
Yeah, well, sort of. I mean, the way they get him out of there is by use of that machine. It's unlikely he'd be able to enter again. But yeah. Yeah. So I think this honor dishonor, or maybe we might find a way to rephrase this, right? Because dishonor seems a little bit negative for the way the characters who aren't as principled behave, right? Maybe a kind of honor versus flexibility binary. And honor is a trait that we tend to associate with aristocracy and with nobility anyway, right? Like it's supposed to be like one of those, traits of the gentry, right? And the characters who show themselves to be more flexible and more responsive to circumstances are mostly servants, right? Even if the old woman was the daughter of the Pope and some princess. Anything else that you guys notice here that you want to talk about or discuss? There's kind of like one last thing I would like to cover because I'm not entirely sure what to do with it. But if there's anything you guys want to talk about, it's better to do that. Okay, then let's spend a few minutes with this Senator Pococurante, whom they meet in Venice. So, what did y'all think of this guy? The name Pococurante, by the way, translates from Latin to something like indifferent or uncaring. Why does they want to visit this guy in the first place? What do they want to see him for? But look on page 69. Right? People talk, said Candide, of the Senator Pococurante, who lives in that fine palace on the Brenta, where he entertains foreigners in the politest manner. They pretend that this man has never felt any uneasiness. I should be glad to see such a rarity, said Martin. Candide immediately sent to ask the Lord Pococurante permission to wait upon him the next day. And so when they arrive, page 70, Candide and Martin went in a gondola on the Brenta and arrived at the palace of the noble Signor Pococurante. The gardens, laid out with taste, were adorned with fine marble statues. The palace was beautifully built. The master of the house was a man of 60 and very rich. He received the two travelers with polite indifference, which put Candide a little out of countenance, but was not at all disagreeable to Martin. First, two pretty girls, very neatly dressed, served them with chocolate, which was frothed exceedingly well. Candide could not refrain from commending their beauty, grace, and address. They are good enough creatures, said the senator. I make them lie with me sometimes, for I am very tired of the ladies of the town, of their coquetries, of their jealousies, of their quarrels, of their humors, of their pettinesses, of their prides, of their follies, and of the sonnets which one must make or have made for them. But after all, these two girls begin to weary me. So this is actually kind of pretty creepy, right? That he has these two servant girls whom he makes go to bed with him, so that he doesn't have to actually woo women who are of his own social class, right? So this kind of lines up with that kind of general theme of like women's relative powerlessness in the novella, but it also kind of speaks to some broader stuff about Senator Pococurante. That let's just kind of go through and see where else we see his interests described here, right? So after breakfast, Candide, walking into a long gallery, was surprised by the beautiful pictures. He asked by what master were the two first. They are by Raphael, said the senator. I bought them at a great price out of vanity some years ago. They are said to be the finest things in Italy, but they do not please me at all. The colors are too dark, the figures are not sufficiently rounded, nor in good relief. The draperies in no way resemble stuffs. In a word, whatever may be said, I do not find there a true imitation of nature. I only care for a picture when I think I see nature itself, and there are none of this sort. I have a great many pictures, but I prize them very little. So let's pause on this a second here. So what is Pococurante's standard for good art? Yes. He wants to see a true imitation of nature, right? I only care for a picture when I think I see nature itself. And there are none of this sort. So is he saying that the kind of art he admires even exists? Yeah, his standard is so ridiculously high, right? That no art that exists can actually meet it.
He seems like a noble version of Martin.
Okay.
Like, just kind of deadbeat, kind of pessimistic, but he's got that nobility kind of privilege about him.
Yeah, well, has Pococurante ever actually suffered, as far as we can tell? Like, Martin has suffered, right? That guy's been through the shit and back. Right, so Martin has plenty of good reasons to believe what he believes. But Pococurante is just bored, right? He's so cultivated and so pampered, so highly educated, that nothing can please him. Everything he sees or hears or tastes just bores him and makes him think of an impossible standard that he's trying to meet, right? While they were waiting for dinner, Pococurante ordered a concert. Candide found the music delicious. This noise, said the senator, may amuse one for half an hour, but if it were to last longer, it would grow tiresome to everybody, though they durst not own it. Music today is only the art of executing difficult things, and that which is only difficult cannot please long. Perhaps I should be fonder of the opera, if they had not found the secret of making it a monster which shocks me. Let who will go to see bad tragedies set to music, where the scenes are contrived for no other end to introduce 2 or 3 songs ridiculously out of place to show off an actress's voice. Let who will, or who can, die away with pleasure at the sight of an eunuch quavering the role of Caesar or of Cato, and strutting awkwardly upon the stage. For my part, I have long since renounced those paltry entertainments which constitute the glory of modern Italy, and are purchased so dearly by sovereigns. And then he goes on to talk about like these beautiful manuscript books of great literary classics that don't please him at all, right? And you start to wonder, it's like, why does this guy own these things if none of them give him any pleasure, right? So I keep striking out with this particular cultural reference, but I'm going to give it another shot, right? Have any of you seen the movie Anchorman with Will Ferrell? Okay, there's that scene at the beginning where Ron Burgundy meets Veronica Corningstone and he's trying to impress her. And he says, I'm a very important man. I own many leather-bound books, right? When one owns many leather-bound books, right, does one own those books in order to read them? they're decorative pieces, right? What are you really trying to do if you own a lot of leather-bound books and you tell people about them?
Make people think that you're smart and read leather-bound books.
Yeah, you're trying to impress people, right? It's a form of showing off. So Pococurante has spent all of this time and money, right, on what is essentially showing off, and none of it gives him any pleasure at all. And I think on the one hand, what people say about him is right, that he's never felt a moment of uneasiness, but he's never felt a moment of pleasure either, right? He just kind of floats along indifferently without really deeply feeling anyone or anything. So I think we can probably fit him into this kind of theory and experience binary, right? Or it's not like Pococurante doesn't have experience, right? He is extremely knowledgeable about art and culture and literature. He just hates all of it. And I think that there might be a kind of sub-binary there between like the specialist and the generalist, right? The generalist who knows a little bit about a lot of things and can appreciate many different things. And the specialist who is kind of so focused on that one thing that they've got blinders on and don't really see what's outside of their field of vision. And that's about as far as I can get with this right now. But I think all of this is going to be relevant context for thinking about the cultural situation that the French Revolution arises from, right? So keep all this in mind when we get to that. Now, I'm going to give you all the reading questions for Rousseau. Rousseau and Voltaire knew each other and also loathed each other. Voltaire, in particular, really disliked Rousseau.